people who are just showing up, who may not have watched the past videos, we've been in this Bible study. There are 6 past Bible studies, and those are on YouTube on the Antiochian Men page for the diocese, which is Antiochian Men is abbreviated Amen, so that's easy to remember. And then DOMSE, which is the Diocese of Miami in the Southeast. So if you go to that YouTube page, you can watch the previous 6. We've been going through the life of David. So tonight we're going to be picking up in 1 Samuel or 1 Kingdoms 29 is where we're going to start. And this is relevant. I've been going through the Orthodox Study Bible in terms of those chapters and what we'll be reading. This section of the Old Testament is very different in the Greek and in the Hebrew, at least the Hebrew that we have now. The Hebrew that we have now, for various reasons, seems to have a whole second set of David traditions that have been sort of mixed in with the story as it's reflected in the Greek text. And one of the evidences of that, probably the best evidence of that, is that there are a whole bunch of things that happen twice in the current Hebrew version. So Saul meets David twice. Goliath gets killed twice. Actually, kind of 3 times, but he gets killed more than once. So there are all these things where 2 different versions of the story have sort of gotten smushed together, and they wanted the editors who are compiling the current Hebrew edition didn't want to lose anything from either tradition, so they just kind of layered them in together. If you're reading an English version other than the Orthodox Study Bible, I don't know how much that's going to affect us tonight, but there have been places where you might have some trouble following because there'd be big chunks missing from what I'm reading. We're going through the Orthodox Study Bible version, which is the Greek version, which, because of that, is pretty easily arguable to be the older version, and just presents one continuous tradition regarding David. And it's 1 Kingdoms in the Orthodox Study Bible. Just about any other Bible you're looking at is going to have 1 Samuel as the name of the book. And we're starting at chapter 30 this evening. Okay, and it looks like it's now 6:02. We'll go ahead and get started in just a moment. As a note for, I know we've got a number of folks who haven't done this live in the past, who are doing it live for the first time now. So the way we do questions is you don't have to wait until the end. I will take questions at the end. And given that I, like everyone else, have a fair amount of time on my hands currently, I will answer questions for as long as people want to ask questions. That doesn't mean it will all get recorded, but I'll hang around and answer questions for as long as people want to ask me questions. When you have a question, if you have a question while I'm rambling on, go ahead and in the chat, the text chat, if you want to type out your whole question, you can just type out your whole question there, and I will read it and answer it when I'm at a point where I can break for a second. If you are on a phone or something, and so it's very inconvenient for you to type out your whole question, or you just don't want to, if it's easier for you, you could just type in there, "I have a question," and when I have a place to take a break, I'll call your name out, and you can unmute your microphone and ask the question. Otherwise, please keep your mics muted for a whole bunch of reasons, including feedback and overlap and all kinds of things that can happen if we have multiple people with their mics all on it at the same time. So I'll go ahead and we'll start with a short prayer. Let me check real quick to make sure there aren't any questions already, preliminary questions before we start. I am actually, I don't know what you're seeing right now, but I am actually, I'm putting into the text chat the place where we're going to start reading tonight for anyone who missed it a couple minutes ago, because I know we've got people still joining. Okay, so that is now in the text chat, and I'll be announcing it again before we start. So let's go ahead and pray for a second before we start. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. So as I mentioned, in this Bible study, since I know we have a lot of first-time people, we've been going through the life of David. And if you go to the diocese YouTube site, we've got, or the Antiochian men of the diocese website, either place you can watch the videos of the previous 6 Bible studies. We've been going through the life of David, and we're right now picking up in 1 Kingdoms or 1 Samuel 30, right at the beginning, to get us caught up a little bit, because even for the people who regularly listen, it's been a month since our last Bible study. We began, in terms of the life of David, with the whole episode where Saul, who had become the king of Israel, the first human king of Israel, had disobeyed God. God had sent him to destroy a group of Amalekites, Amalekite raiders, led by an Amalekite king. We talked particularly in the second Bible study. If you go back and watch that video, I won't go through all that again. We talked for a long time about the clans of giants who show up in the Old Testament were sort of enemies of God and sought at several points to destroy the nation of Israel. The Amalekites were one of those groups, and so God told Saul to wipe them out, to not take booty and pillage from them, and not to take any captives. And instead, Saul had seized all their livestock for himself and had kept their king alive and sort of paraded him around as a trophy after this battle to sort of glorify himself and take credit for the military victory. And so because of that, because he had been disobedient, God told him that he would no longer be the king of Israel, that he had been rejected. And Saul, rather than repenting at that point, just sort of hardened and became angry and bitter about the having been rejected as king. And so Samuel surreptitiously, the prophet Samuel, went and anointed David to be the new king. So David is now sort of the rightful king of Israel. Saul at first did not know that, but pieced it together. David, after killing Goliath, the Philistine champion, gained a lot of respect and praise from the people. He became one of Saul's officials and military commanders. Saul's jealousy of David grew and grew and grew. He's become more bitter and angry. It got to the point where he was seeking to kill David. David went on the run with Saul chasing him, trying to kill him. During that time, David had several chances to take Saul's life, but didn't. Saul, on the other hand, committed atrocities. He killed an entire city of priests and their wives and children because they helped David on the way. He's become sort of a truly demonic figure, unfortunately, rather than repenting, even though God has been giving him chance after chance after chance. Finally, he swore he wouldn't do anything to David, but David didn't trust him. David has, as we pick up tonight, been taking shelter with his most trusted men. He has a small group of trusted military men. They've been hiding out with the Philistines. They've been sending David to attack his own countrymen in Judah, and David instead has been attacking the common enemies of both Judah and the Philistines. So he's been kind of keeping this ruse going that he's loyal to the Philistines while hiding out among them because Saul can't get to him there. Saul is now preparing for a big battle with the Philistines. And so in the last Bible study, we saw how Saul, because the prophet Samuel had died, and because he's now sort of cut off from God, decided that he needed to make sure he was going to win this battle. And so he went to what's described, of course, famously in the King James Version as the Witch of Endor, not the moon from Return of the Jedi, where the Ewoks live, but a city. But who was a medium who channeled normally demonic spirits. And at that point, Samuel appeared to Saul and told him he was going to die in this battle. Meanwhile, David, even though he had gone with the Philistine military to where the battle was going to take place, was basically sent home by the Philistines because although the Philistine king within whose territory David has been operating trusts him, the rest of the Philistines didn't trust him. And so they basically sent him home and said, you need to go back to Philistia and protect our flank, right? While we're out here fighting the Judites, you make sure no one else comes and attacks our cities while our military's away. And so that's where we left off last time. And that's where we're picking up now in First Kingdoms or First Samuel chapter 30. So Pedro, I will answer your question in the question and answer time. So I promise it will be the first one I answer. So First Kingdoms chapter 30, verse 1. Now before David and his men entered Ziklag, on the third day, Amalek had entered and attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire. So Ziklag is a town in Philistia that was given to him by the local king. The king would have been the king of one of the major cities. One of the five, there were five major Philistine cities, but then there were also, of course, towns and villages in the areas around each of those cities. And so as a sort of military official, David and his men were given this city, Ziklag. And by the time David gets back to it, after being sent home from the front lines, it says here that Amalek has attacked. Now, this isn't Amalek the person. Amalek the person has been dead for a few centuries at this point. When it says that Amalek had attacked, it means the Amalekites, one of the tribes or clans of Amalekites, have come and attacked it and have burned down a significant number of the buildings, meaning they didn't just come and steal, they came and destroyed the town in an all-out attack. These are Amalekites like those who Saul failed to take care of. but the Amalekites in particular have been sort of a plague on Israel literally since the beginning of their existence. Back in the book of Exodus, as the Israelites had come out of Egypt and were crossing the desert, when they were first approaching Mount Sinai, so before the law had even been given, before they get to Mount Sinai, the Amalekites attacked them and tried to wipe them out at that point. They sort of laid siege to Mount Sinai. And the phrase that's used in the book of Exodus is that the Amalekites dared to set a hand upon the throne of Yahweh. So they literally represent sort of this demonic force that hates God and his people and is trying to destroy them. So David comes back to find that this city where he and his men rule, where their wives and children are, has been brutally attacked by the Amalekites while he was away at the front lines. This is also obviously an attack of opportunity. They would have known that the Philistines were going out to do battle with the Israelites, and so seen this as an opportunity to, in a cowardly way, sort of attack from behind while nobody was there to defend the city. They did not kill the women, and all who were there, from small to great, were carried away captive as they went on their way. So they didn't just come in and slaughter everyone. They came in and destroyed the place, but they took the people who were there, which would have been the older men who were beyond military age, people who were sick, and women and children, primarily. They take them, when they carry them off, that means they're taking them as slaves, with all that entails. And what I mean by that is that because these aren't people who are capable of fighting in the military, they're also not being taken as slaves to do work, probably, most of them. So this is slavery of the most sinister kind that they're destined for. Verse 3, so David and his men came to the city, and it was burned with fire. Their wives, their sons, and their daughters were taken captive. And David and the people with him lifted up their voices and wept until they were too tired to weep anymore. And both David's wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelite woman and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, were taken captive. So it isn't just that some of the local Philistines, had people kidnapped. This is everyone. This is even David's two wives. Now we've in previous Bible studies, we talked about the fact that one of the signs that David himself is shall we say, a flawed individual. And we're going to see this play out as we go further through the life of David in the Bible study, where his own personal sins and flaws and weaknesses are going to come out. One of the hints we've already gotten is the fact that he's already got multiple wives. These actually aren't his only two wives either. His first wife, Michal, the daughter of Saul, he left back in Judah when he fled. He left with Saul when he fled to go on the run because, of course, her father was trying to kill him. But clearly, since he's taken two other wives, he did not feel the need to remain particularly faithful to her. This raises, which I'll talk about just briefly, the issue of polygamy in the Old Testament, because you'll often hear people say, "Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about polygamy. In fact, if you look at the Old Testament, there's all this polygamy going on." There's two aspects of that. The first is that it is true that within Judaism, there was no real stigma applied for many centuries to polygamy. And what I mean by that was there were still Jewish groups practicing polygamy until the 11th century AD, long after, 1,000 years after the New Testament was written. So coming to that conclusion, especially if you just read the Old Testament, that it's indicating polygamy is okay. That's not an impossible conclusion to come to. On the other hand, there are a few important things. The biggest one, obviously, would be what Christ says about marriage when he's asked about divorce. And he refers back to the creation of woman in Genesis 2, and talks about how the two cleave to each other and become one flesh, and that this is how it was at the beginning. He says that in response to a question about divorce, but that seems to apply broadly. And of course, that's what we see, not just in Genesis 2, but in the rest of Genesis as the story plays out. Much is made of the fact that Isaac loves Rebekah, sort of the love of Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah is one of the defining characters of Isaac in Genesis. Most of the other things, I mean, he's the child who's promised to Abraham. There are all these significances that Isaac has to his father Abraham. But in terms of his own life and his own adulthood, the main thing we know about him, because it's the main thing that's spoken about by Genesis, is that he loves his wife Rebekah, and that the two of them are a couple. Whereas we see examples of, for example, Isaac's son Jacob, who is in a polygamous situation, and all of the problems that causes. And we're, of course, going to see that with David play out. We're going to see that with Solomon play out. But as one final note, you will often hear people who are discussing this. And the reason I'm bothering to discuss it is not so much that there are a lot of people advocating for polygamy in our modern world. I should say that, since part of the Utah State House has now moved to legalize it. So there are some people wanting to advocate for polygamy, but it's not a huge movement within especially Orthodox Christianity to try to bring back polygamy. But polygamy gets brought up as a counterexample for people who want other types of quote-unquote marriage to be normalized. They try and use polygamy as a wedge to say, oh, well, the Bible doesn't really teach that marriage is between one man and one woman. There actually is a commandment against polygamy in the Torah. It's not obvious because of how it's translated. It's in Leviticus 18, which I won't make everybody turn to now or anything. Plus, a lot of that chapter is gross because Leviticus 18, the beginning part especially, lays out a whole series of commandments about sexual immorality that go into a lot of detail of different potential sexual relationships that are invalid and wrong and sinful. There is a commandment, though, in that chapter that says that it is a sin for a man to marry a woman and her sister, is how it's usually translated in English. But there are a couple interesting things about this. One is that it's not in the list of family members. So, for example, there's a commandment that a man can't marry a woman and her mother. Right? A man can't be with a woman and her mother, or a man can't be with his aunt, or etc., as you can imagine. And this commandment about a man not marrying a woman and her sister is not in that section with those commandments. It's later on in the chapter, away from those commandments. Also, it's talking about marriage, not just sexual relationships. This is specifically about not marrying a woman and her sister. But if you read the commandment in Hebrew, it says a man cannot marry sister to sister, is what it literally says. And that Hebrew phrase, sister to sister, or woman to woman, and sometimes in the Old Testament, man to man, that Hebrew phrase is used all the time in the Old Testament to refer to groups. So, for example, if you're going to say, you have a big group of people, and you were going to say each man took his own sword, you would say they took swords a man to a man in biblical Hebrew. So that phrase is not used to describe literally sister to sister to mean two sisters. Sister to sister or woman to woman means each woman or every woman or a series of women. So that commandment very literally means a man should not marry a series of women, or a man should not marry more than one woman. So there is actually a commandment against polygamy. There are people who will fight you on that. That's why I pointed out the other things first. And I know that not everybody is able to go into the Hebrew and stuff and do that, right? But there actually is that commandment. But the other examples, the fact that every polygamous situation in the Old Testament has these horrible, sinful, frightening consequences, right? Whereas the relationships between and marriages between one man and one woman are held up as examples by the text, should be clear enough by itself to make that case. But so the fact that David has done this and has these multiple wives is not a good thing. But now they've been taken away and taken into slavery, most likely in the context of the ancient world, sexual slavery. And so you can imagine why David and his men were now weeping until they had no tears left at what had befallen them. It wasn't about the material loss of whatever they had in the city, but about their loved ones. So verse 6, now David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For the life of every person was grieved, each for his sons and for his daughters. But David became strong in the Lord his God. Okay, so the people of the city who are still there, who weren't taken away as slaves, they're pretty angry at David because David, of course, was in charge of this city and the ruler of this city. He went off to fight in this battle, and while he was gone, this happened. Their children were taken away as slaves, their wives were taken away as slaves, their homes were destroyed. But note that David, even now, when he's under threat, when his very life is being threatened by these people, and his own wives are gone, it doesn't say that he was angry. It doesn't say that he gave an impassioned speech and won them back over, like at the end of Independence Day or something. But what David does is he becomes strong in the Lord. He becomes strong in Yahweh, right? He takes shelter in God and knows that one of the things we've talked about with David, and one of the big contrasts between him and Saul, is that what we've seen with Saul from the beginning is that Saul has his own enemies. He has his own enemies list. Whereas for David, the enemies of God are his enemies, and the friends of God are his friends. And so he knows that now that these people have done this to him, that he is going to have God with him when he goes to attempt to make this right. And so that allows him now to draw this strength. The fact that he has placed himself so firmly on God's side and allied himself with what God is doing in the world means that he now knows that when he is in distress, God is going to be with him, because he's been doing everything he can to be with God. And so this is obviously an important lesson for us. There's a famous quote from Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, where a newspaper reporter asked him if he thought God was on the side of the Union. He said, do you think, you've got God on your side in this war? And Abraham Lincoln said, the question isn't whether God is on our side. The question is whether we are on God's. And this refers to a whole way of thinking about and living our lives, where we don't decide what it is that we want to do. We don't think about what we want to have happen, who we want to be, what we want to have, what we want to get. But we think about rather what God is doing in the world, what God's purposes are, what God wants to accomplish, who God wants to reach, who God wants to help, whose side God is on. And we try to place ourselves on that same side. We try to involve ourselves and participate in what God is doing. And when we do that, when we're with God, God is with us. God is only not with us. God is only not on our side when we choose a side other than his. When we choose to go against him or to separate ourselves from him. That's the only way we end up separated from him. And so David gives us an example of this. What he's had happen is just about the most horrible thing you could have happen. I know we're not allowed to go much of any place right at the moment, but you can imagine back when we were, if you came home and found that your house had been burned down and everything you had been taken, including your wife or your spouse and your children, right, had been stolen away and you didn't know where they had been taken. There aren't many things we can imagine worse than that, right? This is worse than if something had happened to David himself. This is the moment David is facing. And not only that, but imagine that happened to you and all your neighbors came over and said it was your fault and they were ready to kill you for not having been there to protect your property. That's the position David is in right now. And yet we're told that he wept and he mourned, right? But he doesn't yield to despair. He knows who God is. He knows who he himself is. And so he knows that what he now needs to do, God is going to be there with him to help him. So this is sort of a powerful example to us of the kind of assurance and strength that we can have if we seek to live the way that David has sought to live his life so far, being a part of what God is doing. And David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, bring the ephod. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, surely I shall pursue after this troop, but what if I overcome them? And the Lord answered him, pursue them, for in overtaking them you shall surely apprehend the troop, delivering the captives. So as we can see here, David, even though everything I just said is true, David doesn't take for granted, right? It's not like, oh, well, I've done these things for God in the past, and so now he owes me one, right? This is whatever I decide to do now, he's gonna have my back, right? It's not that situation at all. David knows that he's with God, and so he wants to find out what God would have him do, right? And you notice the way he asks the question. He thinks he knows, right? He thinks he knows this is what I need to do. I need to go chase down those Amalekites, who are God's enemies anyway, and I need to bring back the people who they took. But even having that knowledge, he wants to make sure. And so it says he calls for the priest and tells him to bring the ephod. The reason for that, the ephod was the central vestment of the high priest. It was made of linen. It went over the top of the robe that the high priest was wearing. And it had on the chest 12 precious stones that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And they carried that with them, but it also contained, importantly, what was called the Urim and the Thummim, which were two polished stones. And we don't know how exactly this worked, but in the Torah, God said, I don't want you going to witches and diviners and participating in all of these different superstitious rituals to try to find out what you should do, which was commonplace in the ancient world. We just saw Saul do it. And part of what's going on here with David is this contrast with Saul. Saul goes to the Witch of Endor. Saul goes to this medium to try to find out what to do. David goes to the priest, the high priest, to find out what Yahweh wants him to do. But God had said, I don't want you using those means. You don't need to get astrologers, none of this stuff, right? If first and foremost, you go back to the Torah itself, which tells us how to live our lives and gives us commandments of what to do. But if you've got a situation where you're honestly not sure, there was a way in which the Urim and the Thummim, these two stones, could be used. And we don't know if they were maybe different colors on either side and it was like casting lots, or how exactly it worked because it's not described. But using these two stones, you could ask a question and find out, okay, here's what I need to do. And so that's what David does here. David calls for the priest, tells him to bring the ephod. They use the stones, and so David is told, if you go after them, when you catch up to them, God will fight for you on your side. You will get the people back. He's doing this to ensure, to just be absolutely certain that what he's about to do is what God would have him do. So David went, he and the 600 men with him, and they came to the brook Besor. The rest of his men stayed behind. David pursued them with 400 men. 200 men stayed behind, staying on the other side of the brook Besor. They then found an Egyptian man in the field and brought him to David. They gave him bread and he ate, and they let him drink water. They also gave him a piece of fig cake. After eating, his strength came back to him, for he was without bread or water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, "To whom do you belong and where are you from?" And so David goes and chases after the Amalekites. They come to this brook. David divides the party, right? He says, yeah, some stay on the one side of the brook, because the idea here is that because they forded the water, David's not exactly sure where they went. He's followed them up to this river. And so not knowing exactly where they are, right, he takes some men himself and goes to look on the other side of the water. He leaves the rest of the group camped by the water, in case they didn't cross over or in case they were to come back. And they find this Egyptian man wandering around, who hasn't had any food or water in 3 days or 3 nights. So they feed him. They don't just give him bread and water, they even give him this fig cake. So they're treating him well. They find this man, he's a stranger. They extend hospitality to him. So even when David is here essentially leading a war party, even when he's out to go and get these people back, he's still, when he encounters a stranger, offers this hospitality and this human decency and this kindness to him. So David says to him, "To whom do you belong and where are you from?" Why would he say, "To whom do you belong"? To whom do you belong? Because this person was obviously a slave. Slaves would be marked in various ways in the ancient world, sometimes through tattooing, sometimes through some form of mutilation. There's an example, though it's not extreme mutilation, in the Torah. The Israelites were required to release their slaves every so many years to set them free. And so if that time came and the person wanted to stay, like if they were a household servant and they loved the family who they served and wanted to stay, they weren't sort of thrown out against their will when that time came for them to be set free. They would go and they would have an awl, which is sort of a spike, put through their earlobe. So they sort of got their ear pierced. And that was a marking. So that's a minimal one, but there were more major ones. And this continued throughout the ancient world. The Romans used tattooing for this a lot. But so David knows that he's a slave. And so that's why he asks, "To whom do you belong?" Meaning, whose servant are you? And where do you come from? The young Egyptian man said, "I am the servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago." So you see the contrast here with the Amalekites. This is a person who they had enslaved, who belonged to one of the Amalekites. And as soon as he got sick, the Amalekite who he had served left him to die in the desert. He left him there with no food, no water, no nothing, sick. just abandon him to die. Right? This person to whom David has just shown compassion. We invaded the south of the Colti, and in the region of Judah and the south area of Caleb, we burned Ziklag with fire. David said to him, "Can you take me down to this troop?" So the young servant said, "By God, first swear to me that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hand of my master, and then I will take you down to this troop." So he says, I was with the group that went and attacked and burned your city. And so David says, all right, can you take me right to where the rest of the group is? You know which way they went. And you can see that the slave is still making him swear by an oath that David won't kill him and won't give him back to the Amalekite. And so in return, he'll help David. And when he brought him there, they were there spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and celebrating, because of all the great plunder taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So he leads David there. David catches up with them, and they're not even really in military camp, is what this is telling us. They're not garrisoned. They don't have watches out. They're just all celebrating all the pillaging and all the loot they've taken from the cities they've attacked. And so they're eating and drinking and feasting and probably other things and unaware. Then from the morning star until the evening of the next day, David came upon them and attacked them. Not a man of them was saved except 400 young men who got on camels and fled. So David recovered everything the Amalekites took, and David rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, or sons or daughters, or plunder, or anything taken from them. David recovered it all. And David took all the flocks and herds and put them ahead of the plunder. Concerning the plunder, it was said, "This is David's plunder." So David, now note, David has 200 of his men with him and sets upon this camp. And notice, it is very clear that he and his men only killed the Amalekite fighting men, but killed all of them except for 400 who escaped on camels. So that means there were more than 400 Amalekites there, and David had 200 men. And this is maybe not so subtly trying to remind us that this wasn't about David's military prowess or how clever he was, but this is because God is with him and is fighting with him and is fighting for him. That David is able to make this victory. And once they win and they take stock of what is there, everything that the Amalekites took from Ziklag and probably a little extra is all still there. And David's managed to recover all of it. And they didn't end up losing anything. David returned to the 200 men, the ones too weary to follow after David, who he had made stay there at the brook Besor. Upon his return, they went out to meet David and to meet the people with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them in peace. But all the ill-disposed and the worthless men who had gone and fought with David said in response, that's a great translation, by the way, whoever did First Kingdoms of the Orthodox Study Bible. All of the ill-disposed and worthless men said in response, they did not go with us, and so they will not receive any of the plunder we recovered, except let each one lead away with him his wife and his children, and let them return. Right? So some of the guys who went and fought with David said, hey, these guys who you left here by the water, they didn't do any of the fighting. They didn't do it. They just sat there, right? I mean, give them their own stuff back, right? Give them the stuff they lost back, of course. But I don't think they should get a share of any of the extra stuff. They don't deserve it. They didn't go and fight with us. But David said, my brethren, this you shall not do with what the Lord has given us, who preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. And who will heed your words? For they are not inferior to you. Instead, they shall share alike, each according to the portion of him who went down to the battle. as being the same portion of him who stayed behind with the supplies. So it was from that day forward, it became an ordinance and a statute in Israel to this day. So David says, no, that's not how we're doing it, right? They're no worse than you. They're going to get the same share as everybody else. So he divides everything equally between all of his men who set out on the expedition. And there's something a little bit subtle going on here. It says there at the end that this became the standard ordinance in Israel, because David apparently established this as law, that when a military company went out, whatever the fruits of the battle were, didn't just go to the people who fought, but went to everybody. Whether they were sick and not able to fight, whatever happened, they all received an equal share. What's going on here that's a little subtle has to do with David as king. David isn't reigning as king yet, but he's been anointed as king by the prophet Samuel. So what we see here is David acting as the king of Israel. What I mean by that is kings in the ancient world, including ancient Israel, had one primary responsibility, and that is to establish justice. Justice is ultimately the province of God, or in pagan nations, the gods. Right? Justice, whether it's in Hebrew in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is mishpat. In Egyptian, the word is ma'at. Justice is when everything is in its correct place, when everything is in order, when the whole land is at peace, everything is functioning properly, everything is in its correct relationship. So the job of what God is going to do in terms of justice is set everything in place. That's what he did in the beginning when he created the world. And then when he comes to judge the world, when he executes judgment, it's from the same root, the same word. That is putting things back in their proper place, restoring order, putting things back in order the way they're supposed to be. And so the king has an icon of God in Israel. In the pagan nations, the king was a god. He was a member of the council of gods. And so he was sort of their agent on earth to accomplish this. But in Israelite society, the king of Israel was the icon of God in heaven, the image. And so his job was to establish justice on earth that paralleled the justice that God had established in the heavens. And this is part of where that phrase in the Lord's Prayer comes from: "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That was the task of the king. And that whole theology was picked up in the after the conversion of Saint Constantine, the Roman emperor, to apply to the Byzantine emperor and then to the Tsar. That was the idea. That's why he was anointed and consecrated in a sacrament, in a church rite, was because he was being put in place as an icon of Christ on earth to establish his justice on this earth. And so what David is doing here by establishing justice, establishing fairness, establishing what's right, even though right now it's just these few men in this one city who he's functionally ruling over, he's acting as king, right? He's acting as king. And part of how we know that's what he's doing is that he invokes God here. He says, look, you and I, to the other men who had gone into battle, you and I didn't win this battle. You and I didn't secure this, right? But it was God. It was Yahweh who went with us and fought with us, who secured this. Therefore, it needs to be administered fairly the way he administers it. Now, where would David have gotten the idea that that's how God wanted him to divide things, that was the kind of equity that he should show? Well, he's getting it from the Torah, because in the Torah, when God brought the Israelites into the land of Canaan, there's a big long section. It's most of it's in Numbers, and I know when we start trying to read through the Bible, we get through Genesis and the first half of Exodus, and then we slog through the second half of Exodus, and then somewhere in Leviticus we usually wash out. But if we're really adventurous, we might make it to Numbers and then fall asleep somewhere in there. And these land grant parts where it's talking about how many children people had and how many clans there were in the tribe of Reuben and stuff. I mean, I know it gets dry, but in there, the point is that each family got the same size piece of land. God granted to everyone equally, and not only that, but He set in place the Jubilee year, every 50 years, when no matter how badly that family had messed up, no matter how much of their land they had lost, or on the converse, no matter how much they prospered and how many other people's land they'd bought up, everything reverted back to the families who had originally owned it, or at least it was supposed to in the Torah, so that there wouldn't be generational poverty or generational extreme wealth. Every 50 years, fresh start, right? So you could ruin your own life, but you wouldn't ruin your grandchildren's lives, at least if this was followed. But this kind of equity of the same starting, that's what David is drawing on. In Deuteronomy, there are at the end a series of commandments where it's Moses preaching, who says, when you have a king, here's the things. One of the things the king is not to do is multiply wives, so we've already seen that's a problem. But one of his most important duties was the king was to make a copy for himself of the whole Torah. And he was to study it and he was to learn it, to use to accomplish his reign. Because remember, the goal of his reign now is to establish God's justice on earth. And so to do that, he has to study the Torah. So we're seeing here a practical example of David doing that. We're trying to see this is why David is God's chosen king, because he's doing what the king is supposed to do. He's studying the Torah, he's understanding it, and he's applying it to bring justice about here in this world. I'm going to go back and answer a question because I missed it when it was first asked. I was asked if the Urim and Thummim were the context for Proverbs 16:33, where Solomon writes, "We may throw the dice, but the Lord determines the fall." I think there's probably a relationship there. I mean, I think Solomon was using that as a broader principle in the fact that there's not chance, right? That there's not really chance, that God's hand of providence is in everything. Things aren't accidental. But I also think the immediate reference that he was comparing it to, throw the dice, is a very modern translation. It would have been referring more to casting lots. And the primary example of that, especially in Solomon's day in the temple, would have been like the Urim and Thummim, depending on exactly how they were used. So there's a connection there. I couldn't say for certain that, yes, he's directly referring to the Urim and Thummim there, but there's definitely a connection in principle between those ideas. Okay, so David has made this ruling, and things are going to be divided evenly and with equity to everyone who went into battle. Okay, verse 26, now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, behold, from the plunder of the enemies of the Lord, to those who were in Bethshur, to those who were in Ramah of the south, to those who were in Jatir, to those who were in Aroer, to those who were in Amadi, to those who were in Siphmoth, to those who were in Eshtemoa, to those who were in Gat and in Kinnon, and to those in Saphek, and to those in Timnath, to those who were in Carmel, to those who were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, to those who were in the cities of the Kenites, to those who were in Jeremoth, to those who were in Beersheba, to those who were in Nu, to those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to pass through. So David Now, it doesn't say he sent them shares. This is David taking his own share of what was taken. And rather than keeping it for himself, right, he describes it as the plunder from the enemies of the Lord, the enemies of Yahweh, not his enemies. Not, here's what I took from my enemies. Behold my glorious victory. But here is what was taken from the enemies of the Lord. These people were God's enemies. God has defeated them. This is the result. And he sends it to all of the places where he hid, all of the places that have helped him when he's been running from Saul, all of the places up till now. He shares it with everyone. These are mostly cities in Judah. Gat is actually one of the Philistine cities, but that was a place where he hid for a time, where they sheltered him. So he shares it. He shares it with everyone. This imagery is actually picked up a little bit by St. Paul in talking about Christ's victory in his resurrection, and then talking about the ascension. He says he has led captivity captive, and he gave gifts to men. That is this kind of imagery, the idea of David giving these gifts. The idea is Christ has won this great victory, and he hasn't kept this victory for himself, but he's shared and given to us all of the fruits of this victory, all of these great gifts. And interestingly, when St. Paul says that, he's actually changing the quotation from the Old Testament. The Old Testament said he's led captivity captive. He has received gifts from men. St. Paul is shifting it to reflect both what Christ did, but also this idea, sort of David's graciousness in sharing and his not taking the credit for himself, which obviously, again, stands in contrast to the whole issue with Saul originally losing the kingship because he decided to keep all of the pillage and keep the victory and the credit for himself against the same Amalekites earlier on. David is the opposite. Just a note about those who are in the city of the Kenites, because if you have the misfortune of going into certain circles on the internet that talk about the Old Testament and the Bible, you will find all kinds of bizarre things venturing well into conspiracy theory territory about the Kenites in the Old Testament. They only pop up in a few places. The Kenites pop up in Exodus with the Midianites. They pop up here. And the reason why there's all this weird conspiracy stuff is that Kenites is really sort of the sons of or the descendants of Cain. And while it may not be obvious when I say it with that Hebrew pronunciation to English speakers, Cain is the name of Cain, like Cain, the brother of Abel, Cain in Genesis 4. Some people want to try to make these Kenites, when they pop up, the descendants of Cain, Adam and Eve's son Cain, or to try and say they're somehow evil, or so there's a whole kind of, you can imagine, there's a whole rabbit hole of bizarre conspiracy theories to go down there. But just to set that aside, the other thing is that Cain, in this case, is a word for a coppersmith. The ones who show up, for example, who are called, usually it's translated Kenites in English, the sons of Cain, in Exodus for Moses, are with the Midianites, like with his father-in-law Jethro. The Midianites were sort of a mix of Edomites and Ishmaelites, so they were descended from Abraham. They were Semitic people, but they weren't Israelites. They were descended from Jacob or Israel. And that region was one of the places where you could mine copper. the region of Edom, which is to the southeast. If you're familiar with this ancient city of Petra, that's in what used to be Edom, where the Edomites dwell. So this was one particular tribe or group who were renowned for being coppersmiths. That's who the Kenites are. There's nothing more sinister or conspiratorial than that. They're not a tribe of devil worshippers. They're not descended from Cain. They don't look funny or have horns. They don't have the mark of Cain. All of Cain's descendants were killed in the flood, right? according to Genesis 6-9. Yeah, anybody who tries to bring that up around you, as much as some of us may love conspiracy theories and stuff, they're a tribe, they're a clan of coppersmiths from among the Edomites. Okay, so now we've seen what happened with David. In the text, we've been cutting back and forth, sort of seeing what David's doing, seeing what Saul's doing, seeing what David's doing, seeing what Saul's doing. So now we're going back to the place where Saul and his men, the Israelite army, are getting ready to face the Philistine army. So chapter 31, verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines. They fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle weighed heavily against Saul. The javelin throwers and the archers hit him, and he was wounded in the belly. So Saul had already been told. He made the further sinful decision of going and consulting a medium. Prophet Samuel had appeared to him and told him after his death, had told him that he was going to die in this battle. He was going to go down to defeat. You notice Saul went into battle anyway. He didn't do this while the battle was going on. He snuck away from his army and went to go consult this medium before he went into battle. Found this out from Samuel, that he was going to die in this battle, he and all his sons, and the Israelites were going to be defeated. And he still goes back to his army and goes into battle. So he didn't even believe the prophet Samuel after he returned from the dead, right? To warn him, to tell him exactly what was going to happen. He not only didn't repent of anything, but he actively shows his disbelief by going into battle, and then exactly what Samuel said happens. Right? And by the time we rejoin him, not only are the Israelites fleeing for their lives and being cut down and killed as they retreat, but his sons have died in battle, including Jonathan, who was his heir, who was David's best friend. And now Saul himself has been wounded. Right? He's been hit probably by an arrow somewhere in the stomach, which is a wound that at this time in history probably would have been deadly, but also would have been very painful and taken a very long time for Saul to die of it. So verse 4, then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it. Do not let these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer would not do it, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. So we talked before, back when David was going to fight Goliath, that a fighting man at this time in history would have someone with him. It's usually translated armor bearer in English, sort of like a squire in the Middle Ages for a knight, but someone who would assist him. This was a very trusted position, obviously, because especially for the king, because the king would be vulnerable to this person potentially. But in terms of getting armor on and off, carrying weaponry, right? Because it was common for them to go into battle. They'd have their sword, they'd have their shield, but they would also probably have some kind of bow. They might have spears. They would have other weaponry. They're not walking around carrying all of it. They would have someone with them who would be assisting them with this. That's who this armor bearer is, right? And so Saul's wounded. It's going to take a long time for him to die of this. The Philistines are coming, right? And remember what he did to the king of the Amalekites. If the Philistines catch him, they're not just going to show up and kill him and say, aha, good, he's dead. They're going to come, they're going to potentially torture him and mock him. They're going to parade him through their cities as a trophy. They're going to go do who knows what to him. And so Saul says, I don't want that to happen. He says to his armor bearer, finish me, right? Finish me off. Armor bearer is too scared to do it. So Saul takes his sword. When it says he fell on it, that probably means that he took it, he pointed it towards his chest, and then fell forward onto the ground to drive it through himself and kill himself, rather than fall into their hands. Notice, and what we are supposed to notice here is what he doesn't do. What he doesn't do is, for example, pray. What he doesn't do is repent. What he doesn't do is ask God for help. He doesn't do any of that. He just says, I don't want any of these bad things to happen to me, so I'm going to kill myself before they get a chance to do these things to me. So we see that right here up to the bitter, terrible end, Saul is completely unrepentant, despite all of the chances, all of the warnings, the prophets, everyone, Prophet Samuel from beyond the grave, everything that God has done, all the patience God has shown him. He doesn't just say, okay, you disobeyed me, you're going to drop dead of a heart attack right now, right? And I'm going to bring in a new king, right? All the chances God has given to repent, to change his path, he's ignored. He's done the opposite. He's done things in spite of what God has told him. And I'm using the word spite very deliberately there. He is, in every way, continuing to rebel against God right here to the very end. And so Saul is here for us in sort of an unfortunate picture of what can happen in a life that becomes consumed by sin. That even in this situation where you'd think anyone would be praying, right? And no matter how badly they messed up, you'd think, bleeding, all their sons killed, after having it prophesied to them by God, right? On the ground, worried that now you're going to have something horrible happen to you before you on your way to death, a miserable, painful death. You'd think at that point, just about anyone might pray, might ask forgiveness, might seek something. But Saul does not, right to the very end. And importantly, when we get to the New Testament, there's something that you'll often hear, because people don't seem to understand it, about Judas and the way Judas died. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who's a atheist, I guess he calls himself an agnostic now, New Testament scholar, likes to make a big point of it. This is one of the things he points out, that's one of his proofs, absolute proof that the New Testament is not historically reliable, is about how Judas died. Because, of course, the Gospels say he went and hanged himself, right? Went and hung himself. And the book of Acts, St. Luke says that he fell headlong and his bowels burst forth. And so you will get a lot of conservative biblical commentators who want to try to reconcile those two, try to harmonize those two, and say, well, okay, maybe he hung himself, but the rope broke and he fell over, and I mean, they have these like elaborate ways to try to make that work. None of which are actually there in the New Testament text. But St. Luke, both in his gospel and in the book of Acts, does a lot of subtle things with the Old Testament and subtle comparisons. And one of the things that he's doing, especially in Acts, involves the story of Saul, because, of course, he, as one of his primary purposes in the book of Acts, has telling the story of another person named Saul, who becomes St. Paul. And so the language that he's using about Judas should draw us back here to the way Saul died. Right, where Judas, like Saul, that's why he uses language about his death that recalls this falling on his sword. Judas, like Saul, does not repent. Right, he throws the money back into the temple. Right, there's this contrast going on in the Gospels between St. Peter and Judas, where St. Peter betrayed Christ just as much as Judas did, but St. Peter finds tears of repentance and is reconciled, whereas Judas, even though he decides he doesn't want the money, doesn't repent right to the end and kills himself. And so that's a comparison that St. Luke is deliberately making to this Saul, right? To Saul here in the Old Testament. He's comparing Judas to him. And so then when he introduces Saul of Tarsus, and he introduces Saul going around murdering the Christians, murdering the saints, supervising the death of Saint Stephen, coming, to Damascus with orders to imprison and kill all the Christians. He's leading us, literally, he's leading us to expect that, oh, this is the type of person who Saul of Tarsus is. And he's doing that on purpose, because at that point, that was the type of person who Saul of Tarsus was. But Saul of Tarsus' story goes a different way than Saul from the tribe of Benjamin here in 1 Samuel and 1 Kingdoms. So that's why Judas's death is narrated differently in the book of Acts, is not because of a historical inaccuracy or because St. Luke disagreed with the other writers about how Judas died. It's because St. Luke is trying to make a particular point, not just about how Judas died, but about how he lived. And when his armor bearers saw that Saul was dead, he fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer died together that same day. And when the men of Israel, those on the other side of the valley and those on the other side of the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled. The Philistines came and settled in them. So Saul's armor bearer sees that the king is dead. He kills himself too. And when the army realizes that Saul and his sons had been the main commanders of the military, that they're dead, they all just go into retreat. And all of the surrounding towns go into retreat. They abandon the towns and run, and the Philistines come and settle in them. And Israel loses all of this territory in this battle. So the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So strip the slain means exactly what it sounds like. It means loot the bodies, loot the corpses of the people they killed. They're now taking spoils from Israel. And they turned him over and stripped off his armor. They then sent them and his armor into the lands of the Philistines, proclaiming the good news to their idols and to the people. Then they placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body onto the wall of Bethshan. So we see here sort of the process of declaring victory in the ancient world. So they take his armor as a trophy. We've seen this previously when David killed Goliath. He took Goliath's armor and kept it with him and ended up having it in Jerusalem as a symbol of his death. So they take Saul's armor as a sort of trophy and send the armor back to the Philistines, put it in one of their temples as a trophy, and they take his body and they hang it onto the walls of one of their cities in a display. This had 2 purposes. One was, of course, mockery and displaying their victory, but also we have to remember, as in Deuteronomy, cursed is anything which hangs on a tree. So this was a way of placing a curse on Saul even after his death, placing the Philistines showing disrespect for him and putting a curse on him in the afterlife, from their pagan perspective, of course. Probably the most important part of this, though, is when they take them back, you notice it says, proclaiming the good news to their idols and to the people. The word there in the Greek for good news is exactly what you think it is. They came back evangelizing. They came back preaching the gospel, is how that would be translated in the New Testament. And The reason this is important is that's what the word gospel means. So the word gospel was used all through what's called the Hellenistic period. That would be the kings who had been generals of Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great died, they all went to war with each other. The legend is that when Alexander the Great was dying and they asked him who should inherit his kingdom, he said Kratos, meaning the strongest. So they all went to war to prove who was the strongest, and it ended up being carved into 4 big kingdoms. And even the kings of those kingdoms fought against each other. But they used this term, the Romans used this term. They generally used it in the plural, Evangelia, Gospels, I guess. And it wasn't just any good news. The way the Romans used it, this was a series of titles and proclamations that were made before the emperor or a senator or a general came into a Roman city. A herald would go ahead of them and would proclaim their gospel, would evangelize for them. They would come and declare, this is who this person is, here's what they've done, right? Julius Caesar divided Gaul into 3 parts, killed 1 million men and took 1 million slaves, right? Right down the list of all the titles and all the victories. So this is sort of the root original meaning of that term. What we see the Philistines doing here, they're going and proclaiming and declaring their victory. Why that's important is that the term, when we define gospel as just good news, that's watered down a lot from the original meaning, right? Because me saving a lot of money on my car insurance is good news, right? It's good news, if I find, $20 on the side of the road. That's all good news. That's not what we're talking about with Christ. When we proclaim Christ's gospel, what we're doing is we're proclaiming, number 1, who he is, and number 2, what he's done, specifically the victory he's won. Right? The victory he's won. This is why you'll see all over Orthodox things, you will see with the cross, you will see what looks like in English, ICXC. Those C's are actually capital sigmas, and it's an abbreviation for Jesus Christ. But then you'll also see what looks like in English an NI and a KA. That means Mika, that means victorious, right? So what we're proclaiming when we proclaim the gospel is Christ's victory over the devil, over the demonic powers, over sin, over death. That's what the gospel is. The gospel is Christ has done this. The gospel is not how do I get saved? What do I have to do to go to heaven instead of hell when I die? That's not the gospel. The gospel is who Christ is and what he's done. And when the apostles would preach that, this is who Christ is, this is what he's done, and this same Christ is going to return to judge the living and the dead according to their works. It's after they've told them that people ask, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to be saved is the question that results from hearing the gospel, right? And the answer we get from the apostles is believe, be baptized, enter into the church, live a life following Christ, become a disciple, right? Those are the answers. But so that's what the gospel is. That's what the gospel is. And so for the Philistines, though, at this point, the gospel, the good news, right, that they're going and proclaiming is that they've defeated Israel, they've killed Saul, they've done these things. And you notice that they proclaim them not only to the people, but to the idols, right? to the demonic powers whom they worship. They come and proclaim it to, which gives us an interesting picture of even how they viewed these spirits, these gods who they worshipped, right? That apparently they didn't know. They had to come and tell them, oh, but hey, guess what, guys? We won, right? Because they wouldn't have known otherwise. To us, that seems very silly, right? And the biblical authors point out how silly it is. When you read the prophet Isaiah in particular in his condemnation of idolatry, he points out very clearly how silly it is, right? That you've got something that can't make its own body, its own image, that if it tips over, can't stand back up, right? That if it breaks, can't repair itself. And you're going and worshiping it and asking for a harvest, or asking to have more children, or as and it can't do any of these just basic, it can't dress itself, right? And you're asking it to do these sort of cosmic things, how silly that is. But from the pagan perspective, right, the kind of God who Yahweh, the God of Israel, is, wasn't going to be as helpful to them as they wanted, right? It takes a certain kind of spirit or a certain type of God to be petty enough to want to give me all the things I want, to be petty and small enough for me to be able to manipulate them and bribe them with sacrifices and temples and promises, right? To need something that I can give them, for me to be able to get the upper hand on and control. It takes a certain kind of spirit. And so for them, that was exactly the kind of spirit who they wanted to try to use and manipulate. A God like Yahweh, the God of Israel, who didn't need anything, but rather made demands upon humans, that's not the kind of God they wanted to worship at all. That's not the kind of God they wanted to worship at all. And lest we think that we as modern people are somehow smarter than that, or more evolved than that, or they're just these dumb primitives worshiping these, silly things, ancestral spirits and stuff. I think that instinct is still very present in humanity, because we don't go, most of us, at least in this country, and go and carve gods for ourselves and give them names and set up little shrines out behind our house or any of that. But we do make all kinds of idols for ourselves in our minds and in our hearts. We do create all kinds of false images of God that we would rather worship than the true God, who are more amenable to us, who are more likely to give us the things we want, who are more likely to agree with the way we want to live our lives and the way we want to behave and what we think is good and right. We're very prone to make those kinds of false gods and to worship them instead of the true God, because the true God, again, doesn't need anything from us and makes demands on us and requires us to change, requires us to struggle, requires us to follow him. And that's not something that we in our sin are usually motivated to do. And so before we're too quick to judge the Philistines and say how silly they are, how ridiculous they are, we need to spend some time thinking about how we've become like them, and how much our image of God, how much the God who we like to think exists really corresponds to the God who we see in the scriptures and in the hymns and services of the church and in the lives of the saints and in the writings of the fathers. That God, as much as he may scare us, as much as we may realize we're not able to live up to what he requires of us, that's the God, that's the Christ, that's the Jesus who actually exists, not sort of my own personal Jesus who I invent, in my room, or the plastic Jesus I put on the dashboard of my car. It's only the true Jesus who actually exists, who has the power to change me and transform me and connect me to God and give me eternal life. And so that's the one I need to worship, as hard as it will be for me to give up some of the things I need to give up and to change some of the things I need to change, and to humble myself in terms of my own ideas of what is right and wrong, and what I need and what I should do. Verse 11, and the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines did to Saul. And all the valiant men arose and traveled all night in order to remove the body of Saul and the body of Jonathan his son from the wall of Bethshan. They carried them to Jabesh and buried them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the field at Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. So this is actually how the book of 1 Samuel or 1 Kings ends, kind of a downer. But we see that the valiant men, these warriors, go and ask for go and take the bodies of Saul and Jonathan down off the wall where they're on display, where they've been hung as a curse. Take them down and go and bury them. And this is sort of a two-stage burial. They bury them immediately, and then after a period of time, they take their bones back to their home to rest with their fathers. And after burying them, they do this 7-day fast. And this 7-day fast is exactly what it seems. It's not just, well, we're sad, so we're not going to eat anything for 7 days. That's not how fasting works in the scriptures. We know that, right? Fasting is directed toward God. This fast is a fast of mourning for the souls of Saul and Jonathan. We may have been taught wrongly that the idea of praying for the departed is some kind of new thing that shows up in Christianity at some point. This is deeply ingrained all the way through the scriptures. It's deeply ingrained in Judaism. Even rabbinic Judaism today does it. But we see it all over the place in the Old Testament. We see it all the way back in Genesis when Sarah dies, who's the first person who we see die and get buried. The places where people are buried are always noted. And the reason they're noted is not just, oh, well, here's a fun fact, this is the place where they were buried. It's because that's became a place of pilgrimage where people would go and pray. Were these places where their fathers and forefathers and these great saints from the past were buried. So there was prayer to and with and for the departed all the way through. So this 7-day fast, that's what they're doing. They're not just mourning and sad that Saul and Jonathan died, right? But they're having this fast and this vigil for them. This evolves in rabbinic Judaism into the idea of sitting Shiva with someone who has passed away. But that idea is also very present in Christianity. We have the tradition in the Orthodox Church of sitting with the body of someone who has departed this life before their burial and reading the Psalter to them, reading all the Psalms to them. I don't know if anyone listening has ever done that. I have twice done that. Once with my father and once with the body of a parishioner who was resting in the church before her funeral on the next day. And that is a very powerful experience to have. So if you ever get the chance to do that for someone who you love, take that opportunity to sit with them and read the Book of Psalms. But this is the sort of the earliest phase of that, and we see that for Saul, that despite everything that happened, this is a tragedy, right? Saul died wicked and unrepentant. Jonathan, not so, right? But we see that in both cases, there's this time of mourning and of prayer for their souls, where there's not sort of a judgment by the elders of the people cast on them. It's God's to judge, but they pray and fast and intercede. So I was maybe going to do the first chapter of 2 Samuel, 2 Kingdoms, but we're coming up on the normal time for the Bible study to end. And as promised, I want to answer as many questions as people have. So, and I know we've got a couple couple questions in here. One of them I think I answered to David. Why would they preach this good news to their idols? If I didn't sufficiently answer that, let me know, and I will talk about that some more. And Peter said some churches do the vigil with the Psalter at the tomb of Christ in Holy Week as well. Yes, that is one place where it's not as common now for people to necessarily do that with a loved one, but it has become very common, and Teen Soyo has pushed for this as well, very strongly, that we have people doing the vigil and reading the Psalter at the tomb of Christ in Holy Week, and that is a part of this same tradition. I've got a couple longer answer questions, so I have one more short answer question to do, and then I'll get into the longer ones. Where did the book names 1st and 2nd Samuel come from if he died halfway through the first book? Yeah, that's the pretty obvious evidence that the prophet Samuel did not write 1st and 2nd Samuel, is that he dies partway through 1st Samuel. Yeah, as you can see, in the Greek tradition, it's 1st through 4th kingdoms, and it seems very clear, reading them in Hebrew or Greek or any language, that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st through 4th kingdoms, have the same provenance. They're written the same way in the same style. There's no difference between one pair and the other pair. I should also say that 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, or 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, are pairs because each of those was written on one scroll. So originally this was 2 scrolls. There was the 1st and 2nd Kingdom scroll, or the 1st and 2nd Samuel scroll, or the Samuel scroll, and there was the King's scroll, or the 3rd and 4th Kingdom scroll. And so that's one of the reasons for the difference in numbering. 1st through 4th Kingdoms, with the Greek tradition, you're dealing mostly with codices, more with codices, less with scrolls, not completely, but you start dealing more with codices. So you're not having them in scroll form where it's based on how much text you can put on a scroll of a certain size in terms of the divisions. So calling it the Samuel scroll, right? Now, if we could say 1st and 2nd Samuel is one book. It was not named after Samuel because he was the author. It was named after Samuel because he's a central figure. The book begins with the birth of Samuel. That's the first thing you read about. And so it follows through his whole career and his whole life up to his death. And there is not the same level of narration. Like, we don't get a narration of Saul's birth or David's birth. We get a little bit with Solomon and his childhood. But so that is the origin of the name, is him as a central figure. Yeah, to Sarah, I will touch on that briefly. That's a link to the video. Yeah, I'm going to summarize. that's a link to the video. I went into that in great detail. And if I had gotten into chapter 1 of 2nd Samuel or 2nd Kingdoms, I was going to talk about that a little bit again, because part of the first chapter, the end of the first chapter, there is David's lament. He sings a song of lament about Jonathan having died. And there's a phrase in there that, for anybody who can't see chat, I should have said this first. Sarah asked about the claims made by some people that David and Jonathan had a sexual relationship. They had a same-sex sexual relationship rather than friendship. There's a line in that where he says he loved Jonathan more deeply than any woman. And of course, they jump up and down that, oh, this is clearly is sexual. And at its core, again, this is just a summary, and you can go to that link to see my long discussion of it. At its core, the problem is people are reading in modern concepts and modern viewpoints that are completely alien to the ancient world. The whole idea of, I was just talking about polygamy earlier. The whole idea that you have these sort of loving mutual relationships between two people just didn't exist right in the ancient world. People didn't go and meet someone and fall in love and have this romantic relationship and decide to get married in the ancient world. When you hit 12 or 13, your parents made an agreement with someone else's parents, and you married them, right? And they were also 12 or 13, and you may not have ever met this person before the day you got married, right? That's how marriage worked. So there wasn't this idea so all of that is being read back into what in David and Jonathan, all of the texts we have about them. If you look at other ancient literature, they're following standard patterns for two people who are very deeply close friends. And it is to the great detriment of us in the modern world. And I talk about this in that video because that, of course, was aimed primarily at our men's group, that we have lost the concept of particularly male friendship. Our concept of friendship, especially in the age of Facebook, is so watered down to the point of being pathetic. Beneath the level of acquaintance, but friendship in the ancient world meant that you were family, right? You were like brothers. Like what someone did to one friend, they were doing to both. Aristotle said that two friends are one soul and two bodies. And that's the idea of friendship, the idea of two people who have been through things together, who have formed a trust and a supportive relationship. And the idea that we have in the modern world that can't exist without sex is kind of sad. Like that can only express itself through some kind of sexual gratification. It's just sad. And it's demeaning to the whole concept of a human person and who we are and who we were created to be. Down to this animalistic kind of level, where we can't have these kinds of real deep spiritual connections with other people without, having to satisfy some urge. So yes, and I think that distortion has worked both ways. I think a lot of people who end up getting sucked into a same-sex lifestyle, it's what they're looking for. I think a lot of them is they're looking for that kind of connection with a person. They're looking for real friendship and real companionship, and they're not able to separate that from the physical, and so they get sucked into this other kind of lifestyle that's self-destructive. But for the rest of that, my summary is turning into a whole other thing. So for the rest of that, if you watch that video, hopefully that'll be helpful. I'm scrolling back a little bit. So the temple that Saul's armor was put in has not been found by archaeology, as far as we know, because it just says it was put into the temple of Ashtoreth. That's a very common goddess in the ancient Near East. Astarte or Ashtoreth or Asherah, sometimes in the Old Testament, it's spelled several different ways. that figure, that goddess, was a sort of mother goddess, usually married to, they would have sort of a most high god, a father of the gods figure. So in Canaan, that was El, and then El had Asherah, or Asheratah, sometimes it's spelled, and then gave birth to Baal and the other gods of the pantheon. So that's a very, very common goddess name. And so we have found Philistine temples of that goddess. None of them had anything in them that was identifiably Saul's armor. So hypothetically, we may have found it and just not know that that's the one where Saul's armor was placed. But we haven't definitively found, oh, this is clearly the place and here's a piece of Saul's armor or anything like that. Recommendation for a Bible or book that explains translations from the Greek alongside English. In terms of, well, the Bible I recommend to people, if you want to get really serious about Bible study in English, meaning you're not doing Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and all that stuff, because you have better things to do, unlike me, then the best thing to get is what's called the NET or NET. It's the New English Translation. They have, and they've just published some pretty affordable editions of this. It's called the NET Bible, the New English Translation Bible, with full notes. You want the one with full notes. When you look at a page, there's like this much biblical text, and then the whole rest of the page all around it is footnotes, just explaining everything, right? Explaining every word, every sentence structure, explaining it all in English. I've recommended it several times. I've recommended it to several priests I know who have gotten it and have thanked me for recommending it to them, because it's really sort of opened things up for them in English in terms of being able to get at what the original says without being able to read the original. So that's what I would recommend in that regard, if you want to get really serious about that in English. The translation itself is not based on trying to be readable. It's based on trying to be as accurate as they can to the original. So when you're sitting down to do your morning prayers and you read that day's Bible readings, that's probably not the version you want to read. But if you're doing like Bible study stuff and you really want to dig into it, that's one to have. And I think you can get one for about $30. So it's not inordinately expensive. That's not bad for a Bible. And that's like with a leatherized cover and everything. So it's kind of a nice book. I think there's even a cheaper one with sort of a hardback cover. There's a comment about David having developed a connection with his men, and Jonathan more so. Now, Jonathan was David's fellow commander. He was sort of his peer. But that is an important point. David has these men with him. I've commented on this a couple times in the past, who he's very close with. They're going to become a lot of his court officials once he becomes king. He's formed this bond with them. And there's been a lot of interesting research lately about what happens to especially young men when they go to war together. Because unfortunately, we've had wars going on now for 19 years. And what happens to them when they go to war and when they come back, and the bonds that they form with each other. And there seems to be, and it's around 50 people is around the range, but communities of people about that size, groups of men about that size, who experience stress and hardship and difficulty and loss and fear and suffering and all of these things together, form these bonds where they're talking about the rate at which men who come home, who get sent back, right, who you think would be overjoyed that they're not there anymore after everything they've been through, in record numbers sign back up to go back to be with their fellow soldiers because of what they've been through together. And so, there's a powerful I myself am not a veteran, so I know some, and I think any veteran you ask would sort of corroborate that experience. And so, yes, David has this kind of connection with these people. I mean, when they go into battle at this time in history, right, obviously they don't have guns, but the swords they had didn't even hold an edge very well. They'd hold a point okay, but not an edge very well. So I mean, these are people running in the mud and the blood and beating each other to death in a frenzy, hundreds of them at a time. This was brutal and terrible and as frightening as it gets. And these men are loyal to David and are by his side while people are out to kill him. They're doing this over and over again, fighting at each other's side, trusting each other. This is an immensely powerful thing. And again, to try to take something like that and just say, oh, well, it must have been sexual is kind of ludicrous and sad and demeaning to it. Okay, so yeah, and some people have been dropping out. There's a question: do we see evidence that David is active as the psalmist in the First and Second Kingdoms accounts? Well, one example is what I just mentioned that we're about to see in the next chapter is David's lament over Jonathan, which is a song. It's a lament song. So the answer to that is yes. that these things, some of the Psalms. Well, when you read in an English Bible, your typical English Bible, there are sort of these subheadings over the Psalms. You know, a Psalm of David when he was running from Saul, or when he was doing this, or after this happened, or after that happened. A lot of those sort of superscriptions, they're called, those little introductions, a lot of those are very late. A lot of those got added. Some of them got added, AD. Some of them got added in like the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And they're sort of guesses. Some of them we know a little better because there's a tradition about it going back farther. Psalm 50 in the Greek, 51 in the Hebrew is more in that category, where the idea of exactly what it was David was repenting of, that tradition goes back as far as we can track traditions. But yeah, there are in the text, there are hymns that he's written. And of course, one of the first things we saw him do in 1 Samuel or 1 Kingdoms is be hired on sort of as a musician to play music for Saul when the unclean spirit came upon him that tormented him. That it would sort of ease his suffering until he threw a spear at David and tried to kill him during one of those episodes. So David as musician is definitely presented in those accounts. Oh, yes, and Pedro had to go. But Pedro will hopefully watch the video. He asked about, because I mentioned the Amalekites being one of the giant clans. The giant clans are descended from the Nephilim. And again, if you go back and watch the second Bible study YouTube video, I talk all about giants. And people always get excited when I talk about giants. But Pedro asked how any of the Nephilim survived the flood. Because the place where we hear about the Nephilim, where we hear about the giants first, is in Genesis 6, 1-4. And then the flood happens, ostensibly to get rid of them. And then later on in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua, and then here in 1st and 2nd Kingdoms or 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have these giants like the Anakim and the Amalekites and stuff who are supposed to be descended from the Nephilim. So how does that work? The key there is that in Genesis 6, 1-4, when it introduces the concept of the Nephilim, of the giants, it says, at this time and afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughter of men, they had these children who were the Nephilim, who were the giants, the men of renown. And so the and after is referring to the fact that this didn't just happen at this one point in time before the flood, but that this was something that occurred. And the key element behind these giant clans, and giant, of course, can mean sort of tyrant or bully or thug, and the Amorites are sort of exhibit A of them, the Martu, is that they claimed to have continued the knowledge. They claimed to be the descendants of those who had lived before the flood. And they claimed to have the secret knowledge from before the flood, which was everything from blacksmithing and metallurgy to witchcraft. They claimed to have all of this secret knowledge, and that's what made them powerful and made their civilization superior. So they connected themselves to that and claimed to be their descendants. So the answer isn't so much that Nephilim from before the flood survived until after the flood. It's that there were Nephilim at that time before the flood and after, according to the text. Is there a connection in the commentaries of true stories between David's battle and loss of his family, the battle of Saul and his death? What is the lesson here about David's character? All through this part of the text. Unfortunately, most of the Old Testament, we don't have a lot of patristic commentary for a whole variety of reasons. And what we have is kind of spotty. Like the only full commentary we've got on Joshua is Origins, which is very interesting, but it's also Origin. So that has pluses and minuses, obviously. So we don't have a ton. But the text is over and over again comparing and contrasting Saul and David all the way through. To show these distinctions, sort of bring these things about David's character and Saul's character sort of into relief, into sort of stark relief. And so there were a number of parallels. I commented on a few of them. David going and talking to, summoning the priest to get word from God as to what he should do, and then doing exactly that, as opposed to Saul going and consulting with a medium to summon up a spirit from the dead, being told he's going to die, and then going into battle anyway because he doesn't believe it. So that's a pretty stark contrast right there. The way David treats the Amalekites and the spoils from the Amalekites, as opposed to the exact opposite way that Saul did. All of this is part of an extended theology that goes all the way back into Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, when it talks about a king, a lot of people have been taught or otherwise gotten the misconception a lot of people have been taught or otherwise gotten the misconception that Israel wasn't supposed to have a king. Now that's from the beginning of 1 Samuel or 1 Kingdoms, where they ask for a king, and God tells Samuel to tell them, you don't want a king, and here's why, right? And so people take that and say, oh, they weren't supposed to have a king. But back in Deuteronomy, Moses had already said, when you have a king, do this, that, right? He's not to do this, he is to do that. So it talks about him having a king. So we have to take all the scriptures together to understand what's going on. What it says in Deuteronomy about the king is that God says, wait for the king whom I will send you. Right? So it's already a plan. There's already a plan for God to send a king. Right? He had it in his plan. What happens at the beginning of 1 Samuel, it was even set up what tribe that king was going to be from. Genesis 50 prophesies that the king is going to come from Judah. The end of the book of Judges that we rarely read because it's kind of violent and terrible, sets up this whole idea that the tribe of Benjamin, from which Saul comes, is pretty suspect, and that it's the tribe of Judah who should be the real leaders of Israel. So that's all kind of set up already also. But at the beginning of 1 Samuel or 1 Kingdoms, the people say, we want a king like the other nations who will go out with us and come in with us. Well, go out with us and come in with us means who will lead us into battle and bring us back the spoils. That's what that refers to. And before that, the whole emphasis of the Torah and everything afterwards was, and especially the book of Joshua, is God keeps saying to the Israelites, I'm the one who's going to fight your battle for you. I'm the one. Trust in me. You're not beating any of these things. Jericho being the big example. They don't even do anything. God drops the walls for them. I'm the one who's doing this, not you. I will fight your battles. You need to be obedient to me, and then I will fight your battles for you and win them for you. And they are saying, that's not enough. Right? That's not good enough. We want a king like the other nations to lead us into battle. And that's why God says to Samuel, they're rejecting me. Right? They're rejecting me. They don't want me to lead them into battle anymore. I'm asking too much of them. They want some human king, just like the Philistines wanted those lesser gods who they could manipulate. And so it's that kind of king who God tells them, you don't really want. He tries to warn them off, but when they insist, he gives them Saul. And then sort of all of this unfolds. But David is the image of the king who God was going to send. Notice, David is not the king who God was going to send. Christ is the king who God was going to send. But David is the image of the Messiah. He's the image of Jesus. He's the image of the Christ who's going to come, who's the one who God planned from the beginning to send. Because when Christ comes to be the king, he's not just the image of God on earth. He's not someone leading them into battle against the powers of evil instead of God. He's God himself ruling over them on earth, and God himself leading them into spiritual warfare. So yeah, that comes out of that contrast. And I see we're being cut off. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, and I reckon most of the people know about my podcast and blog and stuff, but I'm going to be doing what is normally my parish Bible study online starting next Wednesday. So be on the lookout for info about that, and everybody's welcome to participate in that too. Do it at least for the duration of us not being able to get together and do it at the church. So thank you, everybody. God is